All right, we are still in our EOG review, and this is day 2, and this is going to be super, super short. We have talked about complete sentences, run-on sentences, fragment sentences. We have talked about exclamatory, interrogative, imperative, and declarative sentences. Today we're going to talk about sentence parts. The two parts that we're going to discuss today are independent clauses and dependent clauses. Remember that we talked about if you're independent, you can do everything on your own. You don't need anybody else, right? Um, I mean, we all need people, but if you're living independently, you're living on your own. If you are you can get somewhere independently, that means you can get there yourself. You don't need someone else to drive you, kind of thing, right? Okay. So independent means the same thing when we're talking about sentences. And an independent clause is a clause that it's a sentence all by itself. It doesn't need anything else. A dependent clause isn't a sentence. It depends on the independent clause to help it make sense. Let's look at this. An independent clause is a complete idea or thought that can stand alone. It can stand independently. So all of the middle school kids were at the dance. That's an independent clause. A dependent clause does not present a complete thought or idea. It cannot stand alone. So all of the middle school kids, that's dependent. It's dependent on the rest of that clause for it to make it a sentence. Let's look at some examples. Although I asked him. It's not a sentence all by itself. That's a dependent clause. It's going to depend on whatever comes before or after to make it a complete thought. He didn't show up to the dance, although I asked him. So he didn't show up to the dance. That's a sentence all by itself. That would be an independent clause. And it makes sense with although I asked him, but although I asked him doesn't make sense all by itself. Okay? Her opinion is silly. That's a complete sentence. So that's an independent clause. Before our last class. What about it? Right? It doesn't make a complete thought. So that is dependent. It depends on something else to help it make sense. Until I see it for myself. This is just like when we're looking for fragments. If it's a fragment, if it doesn't make a complete thought, it's going to be dependent on something else to make it make sense. So until I see it for myself would be a fragment, which makes it a dependent clause. I got a good job. No, that's not a great sentence, but it's a complete sentence. I got a good job. I have a good job. I got one makes it sound like I just went and got a job, and maybe that's what they're talking about. Because I have a cold. Again, it sounds like something else it should be coming. So because of that, it's dependent. It depends on something else. After I have my lunch, also depends on something else. It's dependent. Jim won the bet. That stands alone as a complete thought. So that's independent. The cake is done. Also an independent clause. Stands all alone by itself as a complete thought. Since we asked him. Kind of goes along with that first one, although I asked him. Those both rely on something else to make a complete thought. So those are both going to be dependent clauses. Okay? You need to head on back to your Google form and see what it tells you to do next. There's going to be some practice and then a quiz, a graded assignment for you to do. So go back and read those definitions carefully. If you get stuck, this video is here. It's only about 4.5 minutes long. You can, now that you've watched it, you can watch it again and drag the bottom bar there to get to where you want to be to find the information that you need if you get stuck. Okay? All right. Go do your best. If you need any help, definitely email me.